Okay. All right. Hi, Rob. Welcome to the book club, our newest member, which I think is I would say is a good thing, except for the fact that all of us are here because of a bad thing.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so all of us dealt with this issue of having books coming out during this pandemic. So I'm just interested. Your book, Issei Baseball, Issei Baseball or Issei Baseball? Issei Baseball. The story of the first Japanese American ball players that came out on April 1st. And so what did you have lined up, and what happened, and how did you deal with it up to now?
I had a great West Coast book tour all lined up. I was going to speak at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, which would have been pretty nice. Head up to Seattle. I was going to do 3 talks up there, go to Portland, and maybe a few other places, maybe even over to San Francisco. But that all came tumbling down real fast, right? So what was supposed to be a spring of book tours on the West Coast and also in New York as well, I was stuck at home, and actually used the time to write a second book, which we're not going to talk about too much today, but I decided to enter the world of self-publishing, and I wrote a book on the history of Japanese baseball cards during May and June.
So you actually were productive.
I was productive. I mean, I'm stuck at home because I live in New York, so everything was closed. Even the grocery stores around us at first were closed. So we just stayed at home. We ordered in fresh food, cooked everything. We're still doing that, actually. We're not out and about yet. So yeah, I had a lot of time on my hands. So after a few weeks of moaning and groaning, I became productive.
I'm still in the moaning and groaning phase, by the way. I figure that, by the winter, I will probably have gotten over that, but we'll see.
Oh, good.
So we have something in common. So we're both Phillies fans, or at least we were both Phillies fans, right?
That's right.
Are you still a Phillies fan?
Not so much. I moved to New York in 1990. So I've been living in New York longer than I grew up in Philadelphia. I'm still a 1975 through 1983 Phillies fan, but since then, not so much.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a question here, because I heard your interview with Rob Nyer, and he asked you about the Phillies and things like that. I think you said your favorite player was it Carlton, you said, or Schmidt?
Yeah, I picked poorly, but yes, he was my favorite player.
All right, I'm not going to ask you. Give me your favorite under-the-radar player from the 75 to 83 season. Who did you really like who was not Carlton or Schmidt?
Lonnie Smith.
Skeets.
Right off, right, yeah. And it's because when I played baseball in high school, you wouldn't know from looking at me now, but I was actually a semi-track star, and I was all run, all field, and no-hit outfielder. So he was my guy.
Did you slip in the outfield randomly, just like Lonnie Smith?
No, I didn't do that. I basically struck out at bat. But
yeah, I was a big Johnstone guy. Were you a Johnstone fan?
Sure, absolutely.
I loved the umbrella hat, all the crazy stuff. I don't know why. Yeah. Just like he's like if the counterculture had come to baseball, it would be in the form of Jay Johnstone.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's move off of that. So this book, is this your 5th book on Japanese baseball?
This was the 5th, and then the baseball card book became the 6th. Yes.
Okay, and so can you talk a little bit about how you came to Japanese baseball?
Sure.
So how did that become your specialty?
So I was always a baseball fan, of course, and 1993, my wife got transferred to Tokyo, and I was still working on my PhD. So I'd done my classes, I was writing, so it was a good time for me to pack up all the books and follow her. And the first night I arrived in Tokyo, I'd just done a 14-hour trip on the plane, and then you go through customs for another hour, and then a bus for another hour and a half to the hotel. Absolutely exhausted. Hadn't slept in probably at that point 24 hours. Get to the hotel, And my wife says, get ready. We're going out. We're going to a baseball game. And her coworkers had decided to give us tickets to the Yakult Swallows Hanshin Tigers game in Tokyo. And there I am, kind of probably delirious at that point with lack of sleep. And we go there, and the baseball game was like nothing I had ever seen before. Because if you've ever been to Japanese baseball games, it's kind of like a top 10 college basketball game or football game. There's horns going, there's flags going, there are songs for every single player. And this stadium was moving by the people clapping, jumping up and down, and the trumpets blaring. I was like, wow, this is the best baseball game I had ever seen. And it turned out to be a very exciting game as well. So that night, my first night in Tokyo, it was like I fell in love with Japanese baseball. This is the way baseball I thought was meant to be played and meant to be watched. And since then, I just became a bigger fan. While living 2 years in Tokyo, I went to a lot of games, came back, started my career as an archaeologist, which I did for 5 or 6 years. And then kind of the bug took over, and I found I was spending more time selling baseball cards on the internet than I was caring about my day job. And I started writing about Japanese baseball at first to sell the baseball cards, to try to convince American card collectors that these players from Japan were worthy of buying. And since I was trained as an academic, I quickly found that I enjoyed writing up about the cards I was selling more than actually selling and buying cards. So it only took me about a year before I started working on my first book on Japanese baseball, which came out in 2005.
So was there a lot of money in Japanese baseball cards?
A lot of money? No.
I don't know.
It's a fun eBay hobby business. It gives me enough spending money to go out and buy more Japanese baseball cards or some American cards, which I also collect. But no, it's not enough to call it a job.
Are there any differences, like big differences between what a Japanese baseball card looks like and an American baseball card?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like I said, this should not be an advertisement for this book, but Japanese baseball cards tend to be a lot more colorful than American cards. There's my camera. And a lot of them use kind of the art forms of the woodblock prints, where you can see the primary colors here and the drawings. I think you can see that, right?
Yeah, they look like early American baseball cards.
They do, and these ones I'm showing you there come from the late 1940s, early 1950s. So they're still using a lot of hand-drawn cards at that point, art cards. They're beautiful, they really are. And it's not until you get until the 1970s that you start to see more of the picture cards that you're used to seeing in the US.
So are the Japanese baseball cards of today, do they look like American baseball cards of today, or they still look different?
Yeah. Unfortunately, they just look the same. Yeah. Yeah, I actually don't collect the newer ones.
Well, that's a shame, because those are cool. I mean, those look like, those cards look like American baseball cards from like a generation or two earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. They look like, the tobacco cards and some of the 19th century cards.
Right.
So that's kind of the fun of Japanese baseball cards, is you can buy stuff from the 40s and 50s at a pretty modest price that look just fabulous, whereas the pre-war cards in the U.S. are pretty pricey. So you can build your sets from the 50s, for tens of dollars and not hundreds of dollars a card.
So you have Japanese baseball cards, and now you're doing the research into Japanese baseball itself. How fluent are you in Japanese at this point?
I can order a beer after I have one beer. My Japanese is horrible. No, it's I've studied it. I think I've 3 or 4 times I've started taking Japanese lessons, and I've always get up to Japanese 3, and then it gets really difficult. Like, to learn tourist Japanese isn't that difficult. It really isn't. But once you get up past Japanese 3, the verbs you use change according to who you're speaking to and the status, your status versus who you're speaking to. And that starts to get difficult. And at that point, I always figure, you know what? I could spend the next 5 years learning Japanese well enough to carry on a conversation, or I could go back and write a couple of books. And I'd rather do the baseball work.
So how do you do the research? Are you looking at Japanese sources, and if you, or are you looking at ones that have already been translated? How do you do that? I always wondered that.
Both. For all my books, I start the research in English. You know, I figure, obviously, I'm not, all my topics have to do with U.S.-Japan relations through baseball. So once I come up with a topic that I know is like book worthy, right, that has to have enough there to hit 100,000 words, I do my research in English and I figure out what's there, what's the story. And then I think, all right, what's the Japanese perspective on this question? And I can read a little Japanese. I mean, I can't read a newspaper article, but I can often read the headline, and with Google Translate now, I can get a gist of what's going on in these articles. So then once I identify the Japanese sources I need to round out my understanding of the situation, I hire a translator. And I've had a wonderful, actually I have two wonderful Japanese research assistants. They're full-time translators in other fields, but they're old friends and they're willing to help me with my research. And I'll go over to Tokyo once or twice per book, spend a week there in the libraries with my assistants, and we'll go through the archives and we'll identify the sources, and then I'll leave them with them and they'll translate them and send me back the English.
So are there any other barriers that you encounter when you're doing this beyond language, like cultural barriers or cultural norms or things?
There. I have a lot of Japanese friends who are bilingual, and so I'm given a lot of leeway. There are times when I'm in the research library where I know something is up. Just the response isn't what I expected. I'm like, okay, did I just accidentally become too direct, or what's going on here? Or is it just my Japanese is so bad that they don't want to work at all with me when I thought I was asking for something correctly. But in general, it really is the language barrier for studying. So if there's a book written, a secondary source on a topic, I have to pay to get the entire book translated. And that, of course, is sometimes prohibitively expensive. So there's a lot of topics out there in Japanese baseball that I'd love to write books on. I'd love to go explore. And I just know that it will cost thousands of dollars in translations for me to do it. So obviously I don't even start.
So you've actually had entire books translated?
Yeah. For Bonsai Babe Ruth, a book that's on the 1934 tour of Japan, I knew I had a really special topic there. And there was a lot written in Japanese on the topic, because the 34 tour was the impetus to start Japanese professional baseball. So there were a number of biographies of Japanese ball players who played against Babe Ruth and then went on to be stars that I needed translated. And so that was a pretty hefty research budget for that book.
Wow, that's I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
So you're starting off in the hole.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. I've never made a profit ever. Issei Baseball, the newest one, is about the beginnings of Japanese American baseball. It focuses on immigrants who formed teams in 1906 through 1915. But these men spoke Japanese as their primary language. They only spoke a little bit of English. So the sources I have them are also in Japanese. So that also included translating an entire book that some of these players came out in the 1950s. It was kind of a amateur published memoir, but it was all in Japanese, and that had to be translated before I could even begin the project. And also in Issei Baseball, we went into the National Archives in Tokyo and started trying to find out who these ball players were and what their families were like in Japan before they came over. and that was all done in Japanese. So yeah, it's intense, because if you don't do the Japanese sources, you miss half of the project, right? You don't understand the Japanese perspective of what's going on in these stories. So you have to do it.
Wow. So going through that book, so when I was going through it, it's a lot of fun to read because there's a lot of different characters in that story. And one thing that struck me was that this topic could become a real octopus, where with tentacles that just go all over the place. Because unlike Bonsai Babe Ruth, which is you can really focus on that tour, this one that your most recent one, this one is a lot of different people and a lot of different things. And so how did you figure out what you were going to focus on and what was going to be left to the side?
Well, that was the hardest part. So what Issei Baseball does is I focus, it's kind of like a multi-person biography. There's 5 or 6 fellows who come over to the United States just after 1900, and they're educated Japanese young men, and they want to come and get a better education in the United States. What they find is their English is not good enough to get a college degree, so they stay in California, they kind of work at odd jobs, and they form a baseball team. First, it's an amateur team. In 1906, they become a barnstorming professional team. Then they go back to an amateur team, and in 1908, and again in 1911, they form other barnstorming professional teams. They barnstorm across the Midwest. So the book focuses on these 5 individuals from their birth to when they meet up in California and form these teams to where they go afterwards. And 4 of the 5 end up in the internment camps. So the book is both the immigrant story of these 5 men, how they became Americans, as well as a baseball story. So that's how I ended up. And like you said, there are a lot of ways I could have gone. And it took 5 years from beginning to publication. And some of those was not only the research, which we can talk about. The research was kind of insane to do this. But some of it was the focus. Do I want to write a biography of one of these fellows that nobody has ever heard of? Or do I want to write a chapter book on the history of Japanese American baseball? I played around with that for about 6 months, where the fellows in Issei Baseball become 4 chapters instead of 16 chapters. There was a lot of indecision, a lot of talking with my publisher over at University of Nebraska Press. And finally, we decided just kind of, you've done your research, start at the beginning and start telling your story. And if you hit 60,000 words and you're done, well, then we're in trouble. Then we need to expand. Well, instead, at 150,000 words, I was going, and Rob Taylor of University of Nebraska said, no, you got to cut back. You've got so much here. So that is what ended up with the biography approach.
So talk about the insanity of the research.
Well, nothing had been written about these barnstorming teams before. Some of the experts of Japanese American baseball, Bill Staples Jr., Kariyo Nakagawa, knew they existed, and they had collected a few articles here and there on them. But their focus, both those men's focus, is on the internment camp baseball. And this predates it by 30 years. So I started with their help of a few of the players' names, and I just had to figure out, who are these guys? Mainstream American newspapers tended to ignore Japanese immigrants, except when there was a problem, except when there was a riot or a crime or immigration issues. They completely ignored Japanese American baseball. So what you had to do, this could not have been done before the modern world of newspapers.com and newspaper archive. So what I had to do is start by putting each of the players' names I could identify in the data searches, and looking at every one of the 1,000 hits of people with the same last name and reading them, and copying the ones that were about baseball and seeing who their teammates were, and repeating that process with every new teammate, getting to the genealogical databases and running these names over and over again. because the Japanese names are often misspelled in the American sources. So you get a fellow named Kitsuse, who's one of our main players, and his name is spelled Kitsu-se. In the US papers, that comes up with all sorts of permutations. So you have to figure that out and run each one. So it really took about 3.5, 4 years of writing to be able to reconstruct these barnstorming tours, which were about 150 games for each tour. And I still only got about 120 games for each season. And that took, as I said, 3 to 4 years. So the research was tough. I had to hire local genealogists to go to like southern Iowa and the local genealogical societies to look at newspapers that have not yet been put online. So to just get any information about these teams was very difficult. I'll just keep going if that's all right, Mitch. The real coup came when I was able to, through obituaries, to find the families of 4 of these players and eventually get in touch with them. And then they were able to tell me about their grandfathers and give me photographs.
And some of the newspaper accounts, the American newspaper accounts, they seem to be contradictory, right? In terms of like how competitive they were in games like that. So how do you deal with that?
I do a lot of quoting of primary sources in the book because it's tough to tell. The 2 Japanese teams that I focus on, the 1906 and 1911 barnstorming teams, they were not really strong barnstorming teams. The few times they played African-American teams, they usually got blown out. I think there had 1 or 2 games where they were close. So they're not up at the elite level of these barnstorming teams. So when they went into a small town and played the town team, some town teams they beat easily, 20-2. You know, other town teams they lost 10-5, and so you get a lot of different accounts based on how the game went of how strong these players were.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like I mean, I had when I did my Dick Allen book, when I read the Philadelphia newspapers, they would contradict each other, and that was American baseball in Philadelphia. I mean, you're going back over a century and talking about this barnstorming tour that's going through a lot of these towns that some aren't that big, and you're coming up on reports where some say they were very good, some say they weren't very good, some say it was a close game, some say it wasn't, and so I think that's got to be you're going to pull your hair out with that.
Yeah, it was, and that's one of the reasons why, although it is a baseball book and I focus on baseball, I try to look at the bigger issues. I try to look at how is this team, how did people look at this team? I mean, here they have, right at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, and a bunch of Japanese are crossing the Midwest in areas where many people had never seen a Japanese person before. So how were they received? What did the media look like? What did the fans look like? And if you've read the book, the answer is, well, it depends on where they were. Sometimes they were received very well. Sometimes they were not received well at all. So I look at it, basically bigotry is a big theme of this book. You know, how does an immigrant group that faces a great deal of bigotry use baseball as a bridge to enter American culture? And that's pretty much the theme of the entire book.
So are these books available in Japanese?
Not yet. Banzai Babe Ruth is available in Japanese, but it's the only one that I've been able to sell. I think this book would have a good Japanese audience because it's a story that's never been told in Japanese before. But, you know, once again, with the pandemic, it's kind of difficult to sell books, and especially to foreign rights at the moment.
So have you gotten much feedback for any of your books so far from Japanese people, Japanese baseball experts living in Japan? And I wonder how what their take is on your approach or the stories that you've been telling.
Truthfully, I have not received that much feedback. I mean, my friends like it, but they probably tell me they'd like it even if they didn't, right? there are times like my very first biography, a biography of Wally Onamine, who was the first Japanese American to play professional football in the United States, and then became the first American star to play in Japan after World War II. In that book, because it's written for an American audience, I spent a lot of time explaining Japanese baseball, explaining what it's like to be in a Japanese ballpark. And that would be kind of silly for a Japanese person to read. And that was one of the reasons why it did not get translated. You know, it's the equivalent of explaining what a hot dog is to an American, right? So, but Bonsai and I think Issei Baseball have a tighter focus, and it's something that, with so many sources being in English, translate well to Japanese.
So have you gotten any pushback being a white person writing about Japanese baseball and culture? I asked that as a white person who wrote about Dick Allen and got some pushback. And so I'm just wondering if you've gotten any of that or you haven't.
Not yet. I've been waiting for that question. In my previous life as an archaeologist, my focus was actually African-American archaeology for a number of years. My dissertation is on slavery in Rhode Island and how it was perceived by historians. So I've always been interested in race relations, and specifically the study of race relations, how the media and how historians have, what's the right word, analyzed race relations, and how politics have changed the views in history. So I've been thinking about that question ever since I started. I guess my response is this is a book about immigrants, a baseball book that interests me because it was such a fascinating topic, and that's how I approached it. And my interpretation of the events is how I see them. Some people may disagree, but that's the best I can do.
Yeah, that's sort of how I handled it. I think ultimately, no matter what you write about, you're never writing the definitive version of anything other than your perspective of it, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, most modern historians, I mean, there's a huge debate among historians of the 70s and 80s and even early 90s about, can you write what they call God's eye history, you know, a factual history? And basically most historians have now come down the end and said, no, you know, every single historian has biases. We try to get above those biases, or if we can't acknowledge those biases when we write history. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. You have your biases. I have my biases. The reader has their biases. You do your best to interpret the sources as accurately as you think you can. And that's the best you can do.
Yeah, I think that's the best anybody can do. And my answer always was to people who asked why I would write this, and I would say, well, this was I found it very interesting. Pretty much what your answer was, and then, you know, but other people are free to write their own stories of Dick Allen or whoever they want. I mean, I didn't cover the field to the point where it's now, you know, nobody else can do it. It wasn't like I took somebody else's space away from them. I think that's a problem that I think people feel like, well, once somebody has done it, then nobody else can do it. And then if that's true, then I think that's a problem, but I don't think it is true.
Well, the problem has to do with publishing, really. But every other year, there's a new book out on Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, Joe DiMaggio, you know, Willie Mays, Ty Cobb, and they sell, right? And I keep on thinking, oh my gosh, another book on Ty Cobb. Do we really need it? But it sells, and sometimes it's a fresh perspective. So, yeah, maybe we do need it, right? There is one thing I wanted to add to your discussion about, you know, my perspective on writing a Japanese American history. So there's a lot of, you're probably aware as an academic, there's a lot of discussion on immigrant models, acculturation versus, or assimilation, acculturation versus resistance. And when I went into this project, I thought I would find a lot of, say, resistance by Japanese American baseball players, you know, using baseball to affirm a Japanese identity. Um, what little I found was the opposite, to my surprise. What little I found of finding the players' own words when they were later, when they were in their 70s and they're looking back on their life, they explicitly said we used baseball because we loved it, but because we were American, because we were showing that baseball brought us together. And I thought that was different. I thought that was a different perspective than what you often see in academics today.
So we only have a few minutes left, but I want to switch gears, and I do want to talk about your baseball card book. If that's all right. So that one, as you mentioned, so you self-published that one. So
I did.
How has that experience been as opposed to everything else that you've done, which has been traditionally published?
You know, it was, well, first of all, it was a lot of fun because although I'm a complete amateur when it comes to graphic design and layout, I enjoy doing it. And so it was fun because I learned something completely different. I had never done a PDF book before, which is what the book started out as. So I had to learn the new programs. I had to learn how to get it online. So that was a lot of fun, just doing it and learning how to move my images around and get my images sharper. You know, all that technical stuff I enjoyed learning. It was amazing that 6 weeks after I started, I had a book, a PDF form of the book. You know, somebody who's used to taking almost a year and a half between finishing the manuscript and sending it off to the publisher and seeing the final version in my hand, to have one that fast was just, wow, it's so cool. What I did find is our editors earned their money. I sent my PDF, what I thought was final draft, out to 8 different proofreaders. They all found mistakes, and they were all different mistakes. And so things that as writers, you know, we make mistakes. We put a period instead of a comma. We invert our quotation marks. We do all sorts of things. They versus, or there versus there. I mean, it sneaks in. And I found that I did miss University of Nebraska's press professionalism when it came to the turning my rough manuscript into something polished. But through 8 good friends, we were able to get something out that I think at this point has no typos in it, I hope. And then I found a printer online, and it took a few days to find somebody who could do, my book is all glossy, color, landscape format, oversized. Most printers can't do that, but I found somebody who could, and just gave them the money, and it arrived a week later. So it was pretty fun experience to open up that box of books less than 2 months after I started.
Yeah, that is an unusual experience. So just for the name of that book, since I didn't mention it before, it's an illustrated introduction to Japanese baseball cards.
That's right. It's available on my website, and robfitz.com, and my blog on the website focuses on history of Japanese and Japanese American baseball.
So what's next for you?
I actually have decided I enjoy not working on a big book. For all 5 of my big books, I started the next one pretty much between 1 day and 1 month after finishing the one before. And so as a result, all my mental energy went into that story. I didn't read much baseball outside of what I needed for my research. I rarely read what was popular that year, what had come out, because I was too focused on creating my own work. So I'm using this time actually to read the books that are coming out this year, to do a lot of short studies that I could put up on my blog. Now that I know how easy it is to create a PDF book or even a self-published paperback, I'm thinking of doing a couple other small, under 100 pages, picture books at the end of the year and the beginning of next year. So I'm kind of enjoying this break, and it's a lot of fun just to zoom around between ideas and say, oh man, this looks great. Let me write 15 pages on that and get it out as an article. Oh, this is something I've never seen before. Let's do that next, you know? So I'm enjoying that right now.
Yeah, well, I guess we're all like adjusting to what, not only the realities of what it is, but like when you put a book out, particularly in the middle of this sort of a situation, it's just so draining that the idea of having to start again is just, at least for me, it's just overwhelming. Like I said in the beginning of all this, you know, it's just, even though I have the time, it's just, for some reason, it just feels overwhelming with everything else.
Oh yeah. I mean, I have days like that, you know, where I just sit down, especially now that I'm living in New York, you living in Philly. It's so humid this past whole month that I sit down in the morning, I'm all excited to do, I don't know, X, Y, Z, right? And nothing happens. Yeah, it's tough to get motivated, and every day kind of rolls into the next day, and there's no real difference between a weekday and a weekend for me anymore. So yeah, that's why I find the short projects are working, because they get me excited for a few weeks, and then it's done, you know?
Well, keep them up. You, I think, are the first person who has two things to promote on in this club. So you've got Issei Baseball, the story of the first Japanese American ball players, and as we just talked about, an illustrated introduction to Japanese baseball cards. Rob, this was my first time being the interviewer. I hope I didn't ruin it too much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Mitch.